Have you ever wondered the truth about midwifery? Have you ever thought that although birth trauma is common, it's not normal? Did you know that there is actually things that can be done to change this and to change the way that we see birth in today's society? I want to share with you my story of how I went from a midwife to a birth keeper. My name is Angela Chamberlain. In 2009, I began my midwifery training. The first thing I learned about being a midwife was that it means to be with women. In the first year of my midwifery training, the idea was to focus on low-risk natural birth. After beginning my first hospital placement, I soon realised that this was not the case. Although I was only meant to be exposed to natural low-risk birth scenarios, quite often there weren't any of these scenarios for me to be able to witness, and I soon realised that most hospital births were high risk and complicated. I would go on to learn that this wasn't always necessarily needed to be this way. I did, during my training, witness some very amazing natural physiological births, and with the help of a fantastic mentor, I began to understand the true physiology of birth and was able to support women to give birth naturally in a variety of environments. For example, using water birth or delivering in a position that wasn't on her back with her legs in the air, as you quite often see dramatised on the television or in birth videos. On completing my training, I had a passion for water birth and natural birth. It was something that was beautiful to witness, and I thought going into my career that is what being a midwife would be all about, supporting these women to give birth naturally and only needing the intervention of a doctor or other medical professional in the case of an emergency. I naively went to my first interview as a qualified midwife and asked them about water birth. I was shown a variety of inflatable birthing pools, and I was told that these pools could be used in every room and that all women would have access to water birth if they wanted to. I would soon realise that this was a lie. Once I took a job there as a qualified midwife, I had one shadow shift where I was supported by another junior midwife, and then I was left alone. My first patient had DKA, which is diabetic ketoacidosis, which is a very high risk and dangerous condition. I hadn't studied it at university. I had no idea how to manage it. And I was scared. I was scared that I was put in a dangerous situation where I didn't feel I had the knowledge or the skills to deal with it. I was new to the trust and to the hospital policies. I had new colleagues that I fully hadn't built relationships with. I asked my manager if I could still have some support, as I'd only done one shift unaided. And I was advised that this is normal. You now have a PIN number and it's your responsibility to care for these women. I was scared. I cried. And I spent most of the first few months of my midwifery career in that state, constantly feeling out of my depth, constantly feeling worried that I was going to put mums and babies in danger because I just didn't have the knowledge, experience or support to be able to cope with these high-risk situations. I quickly learned that the majority of hospital births became high risk for whatever reason. Obviously, I have an understanding that medical intervention does have a place in birth and has been able to save the lives of mums and babies. But as my years of experience have taught me, I've also learnt that the intervention that we create as soon as a woman steps through the doors of a hospital is automatically detrimental to her being able to achieve a physiological natural birth. For my first 18 months as a midwife, I constantly felt out of my depth. I quickly learned how to perform under high pressure situations and to follow and understand a variety of hospital policies. None of this which I would relate to my initial training in natural physiological birth. I was working more as a doctor's assistant than I was of an autonomous midwife. During this first 18 months of my career, I witnessed only one water birth on the delivery suite. Despite being told that all women would have access to water births and being shown the cardboard boxes that contain birthing pools that were now gathering dust in cupboards and had never been taken out of the box. After 18 months, I was beginning to get itchy feet and I went to work at the local midwifery-led unit and birth centre. Here I was in my element. I was an autonomous midwife. I was working to promote natural physiological birth. Although still within hospital guidelines, I was promoting women to have natural birth and supporting them in a home-from-home environment. I facilitated several water births and loved working in the low-risk environment and seeing women thrive and become empowered, having natural birth experiences. After about 10 months, unfortunately, my position at the midwifery-led unit ended, as I was called back to work on delivery suite because by now I was regarded as a senior midwife. The delivery suite, not surprisingly, was short-staffed, so I was pulled back there to care for high-risk women, and unfortunately our midwifery-led unit was then closed for births as all the staff were needed to keep the delivery suite with a safe level of staffing. I am fully aware that this is not just my experience, and this is something that has been happening across the NHS in the UK. Several birth centres or midwifery-led units have been shut because the staff have been pulled to work in high-risk areas. While working on the delivery suite, I realised that I was working with students and mentoring them and trying to teach them as much as I could about physiological natural birth. I was encountering third-year midwifery students who were not far off qualifying as midwives and sadly realising that they'd never witnessed natural physiological birth. They'd never facilitated a water birth or a physiological third stage of labour, which is where you allow time for the placenta to be delivered naturally without using drugs. They'd not witnessed women giving birth in positions such as standing position or on all fours. It was actually heartbreaking to realise that this was the future of NHS midwifery, and that these students, no fault of their own, just to the exposure that they were having and the training that they were receiving, were losing the skills and knowledge about natural physiological birth as the over-medicalisation of childbirth became more and more apparent. I also realised during my career that although there was lots of interventions and lots of women who were deemed as being high risk, many of these situations could be prevented with a good antenatal education. A lot of the women in my area that I was caring for had poor diet or ongoing underlying health conditions, and a lot of this was down to poor knowledge. So we would treat them for things like diabetes and high blood pressure later on in their pregnancy without educating them antenatally that changes in their weight and their diet could prevent all these conditions. The antenatal and preconception education is virtually non-existent now within the NHS. So I was continuing to work as a midwife. I was classed as senior, being able to look after what you would call low-risk patients. Every patient that came into my care would be deemed as high risk. They were having epidurals, being on syntocinon infusions, at risk of obstetric hemorrhage. You name it, there was some kind of risk factor attached to every single one of my patients. On the off chance that a low risk woman was going to walk through the doors of the delivery suite and may be able to achieve a natural physiological birth, I could almost guarantee that as a senior midwife they would never be my patient. I was beginning to witness intervention increasing on a daily basis. Our induction rate was phenomenal, probably around 50 to 60%. Quite often the reasons for induction were very, very questionable. For example, maternal age was given as a reason for induction, or SPD, which is symphysis pubis dysfunction, which is a painful around the pubic bone area, and which can cause discomfort for women. A lot of the women, when they were coming in for induction, just were under the impression that it was going to be a quick end to their pregnancy and that they would get to meet their baby soon. The risks of induction and the detrimental effects and the cascade of interventions that was going to happen once we'd commenced an induction process was never ever fully explained to patients. Quite often, if offered with the choice of induction, patients didn't even realise that they had a right to question or ask for further explanation around why it was deemed that they needed to be induced. I regularly, as a midwife, questions doctors around the reason for induction. I asked for evidence to back things up and as to what sort of policies we were following. Quite often I was dismissed or seen as a troublemaker and told just to get on with it. I regularly pushed boundaries as a midwife. I interpreted guidelines as I saw fit. I never practiced dangerously, and I can honestly say I never had any poor outcomes as a result of the care that I gave to the women that I looked after. But I did realise that I had to push these boundaries to enable some of the women under my care to achieve natural vaginal birth. An example of this is, for example, a first-time mum. Once she gets to 10 centimetres and begins the second stage of labour, according to hospital guidelines, then has 2 hours to push the baby out. Otherwise, she then is deemed to a whole cascade of interventions, including syntocin on infusion to increase the contractions, which will then have a detrimental effect on baby's heartbeat. And it really increases the risk of instrumental or caesarean delivery. I would often, when faced with a first-time mother and realised that she'd probably got to 10 centimetres and was approaching the second stage of labour, say that she was only 8 centimetres, thus giving her at least another couple of hours to achieve a normal vaginal delivery. I began to become more and more disillusioned with my job, and I didn't feel like it sat right in my heart. I was no longer being able to be a midwife as being with woman. I was being with system. I was constantly under pressure. We were always understaffed. It just became a cascade of intervention and a box-ticking exercise, making me feel disheartened and like I wasn't giving the care that I truly was capable of. When people go into hospital to have a baby, or when they're sharing that intimate time, they deserve to have somebody looking after them that is truly involved in that care. Quite often, I found myself becoming resentful or complacent due to the pressure I was put on from working within the NHS system. This isn't acceptable and it isn't good enough, and women and families deserve a better standard of care. I'm not being critical of midwives. I've met hundreds of midwives who are passionate about normal birth and who want to facilitate normal vaginal birth and be with women. But the way the system is designed, it is making it harder and harder for women to achieve natural birth. When the pandemic started, it really was the beginning of the end for me. I was already disillusioned with my role as a midwife. But then I was seeing the fear that was being instilled into women, the increase in interventions, and that simple things like no partners, although it was their baby, they weren't allowed into scans with their women. I was hearing stories of partners not being allowed to support their women in labour in other hospitals, and the whole thing was just vile and didn't really sit right at all with how I believed midwifery should be. I also realised at this time that there was a lot of women that were beginning to take control back from their birth situations and weren't going to hospital because they were scared of the rules and they were scared of COVID. So it sort of made me realise that there was a population of women out there that were prepared to take control of their birth journey. And they're the women that I work with now, and that the women that I want to continue to support. During the pandemic, I witnessed lots of things that I wasn't happy with, that didn't sit right with me. Not only having to wear a ridiculous amount of PPE during caring for these women, Their partners were expected to wear masks. And I witnessed on first hand on many occasions any partner that refused to do a PCR test to check if they had COVID, treated with absolute contempt. Once talk of the mandatory vaccination policy was introduced for healthcare professionals, that was the final straw for me. And that's when I decided that I needed to leave the NHS. All my life I'd practiced that I needed to be an advocate for women and for them to always have consent and to promote body autonomy. And then in the next breath I was being told that I was probably not going to have any autonomy over my own body, and that I was being forced to have an untested vaccine against my will if I wanted to keep my job. Although the idea of mandatory vaccination has been stopped now, in a sense, it is still very much around. Anybody that has a current NHS contract will not get a new contract without some sort of coercion into having a vaccine. So although people may think that the vaccination or mandatory enforcing of vaccination for healthcare staff has gone away, it hasn't. They've just changed the angle on it. So, for example, if you were a Band 6 midwife and you wanted to move to another area or to gain a promotion or work for another trust, which would mean you signing a new contract, quite often you would find that a term and condition now put in that new contract would be mandatory vaccination. I then made the decision that this was enough for me and I was definitely going to be leaving the NHS. I didn't know what to do because I'd always been a midwife. I loved caring for women and watching new life come into the world, and it's what I believe I was born to do. I was at a very low point in my life when I met Nikita. I discovered her on Mark Atwood's channel. I was sat in the bath one day listening to a podcast and watched the words that she said and what she was doing with When Push Comes to Shove just became like a light at the end of a very dark tunnel for me. I'm truly thankful for crossing paths with Nikita. She made me realise that there were other options for me. After listening to her podcast, I got into touch with her and we spoke, and she literally gave me the confidence and restored my faith that I could still practice as a birth attendant, looking after women and supporting physiological birth. I have learnt and unlearnt so much since leaving the NHS. I've really rediscovered what true midwifery is about. It's not a medical model. Birth is not a medical procedure that occasionally happens naturally. It's a natural procedure that occasionally needs medical intervention. I've completely gone back to the natural way of doing things and how it should be. Although I'm still aware that there is a place for medical intervention, I'm quite aware also that the over-medicalisation of childbirth is becoming out of control. I'm now working with women that may want to birth outside of the NHS system or may want to birth within that system but have some extra support and continuity of care. The way the system is designed currently, although evidence shows that having a continuity of care model definitely improves outcomes for mums and babies, the overstretched NHS system currently can't accommodate that kind of care. They're already short-staffed with the amount of midwives that they've got, and they're just not in a position to facilitate that. My role now as a birth keeper enables women to have fully informed choices, presenting information in a way that is appropriate and not coming from a place of fear. For example, many women are told that when they get to 42 weeks of pregnancy, that the rate of stillbirth doubles. This is not a lie. They're not being lied to by the NHS. But the information isn't shared in a way that they can understand. If somebody tells you that the chance of your baby dying is going to double, of course you're going to go for the intervention of induction that they're suggesting to you. If it was actually explained to you that the rate of stillbirth increases from 0.01% to 0.02%, that doesn't sound quite as scary, as intimidating as that the rate doubles. They haven't lied by saying it's doubling. It's just the way that the information is presented isn't always in a way that is giving truly informed choice to these women to consent to treatment that may lead to a whole cascade of interventions. After speaking to Nikita, I took the leap of faith and enrolled on her midwife lifeboat course with When Push Comes to Shove. This course was life-changing for me. It didn't necessarily teach me about the physiological aspect of birth and labour because I was already quite well aware of that. What it taught me was about the holistic approach to birth and how to have women-centred care and to help them reclaim control of their birth experiences. It taught me about where I stood in a legal perspective from moving from being a midwife to becoming a birth keeper. And how, although it's a very grey area, obviously it's against the law to act as a midwife, or it would be against my NMC code if I was still a midwife to practice outside of my scope of practice, meaning I wouldn't be able to attend birth outside a hospital. I made the decision to give up my PIN number, so I was no longer governed by the NMC regulations. Not being governed by the NMC means legally I can no longer call myself a midwife. I still have exactly the same knowledge, experience and expertise that I had before I gave up my PIN number. I still am a midwife. I still have all of those skills and the ability to recognise and how to act in an emergency situation. But I'm no longer governed by the NMC. So I'm not acting as a midwife. As a birth keeper, I don't work in a clinical capacity. I work as a supportive role to help women feel empowered to facilitate and take charge of their birth and achieve a natural delivery. I'm able to now witness the true beauty of natural birth. When a woman is left and feels safe and supported in a comfortable environment, labour will progress naturally. The endorphins and oxytocin will flow. She won't feel as much pain or experience trauma as she may do if she was having a hospital-based birth. Going back to the true physiology and witnessing this has really given me my fire back for wanting to be in a position to care for women. And I feel privileged to do the job that I'm doing now. I've realised that although it was scary giving up my PIN number and no longer being able to call myself a midwife, birth in a natural situation and in a supportive environment is not a clinical procedure, so there's absolutely no need for me to act clinically. So being able to educate and support women is the true way of becoming a birth keeper, and watching natural birth unfold in a safe environment is a true privilege. I've never been happier in my role as I am now. I absolutely adore my role as a birth keeper. It's the job that I signed up to do really back in 2009 when I embarked on my midwifery career. It's just taken all the clinical aspects out of it and really helping women become empowered. Watching women feel like they can do anything and conquer the world once they've brought their child into the world is an amazing thing. I've now joined forces with Nikita as I'm on a mission alongside her to change the perception of how we view birth in this country and across the world, of how we can provide continuity of care to all women, to stop the perception that birth trauma is normal. Although it is common, it isn't normal. And also to have an understanding and recognise that sometimes intervention may be necessary, and to help educate people into seeing when this may be required. I believe that all women should feel empowered and supported in their birth journey. By having healthy women and having a good birth experience, it has a positive outcome for the whole family. Unfortunately, postnatal suicide is one of the biggest causes of maternal death still, and this hasn't changed. Also, black women giving birth inside the NHS system are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth or experience complications. We've been aware of this for years and nothing's changed. We need to change the whole way in which we view maternity services and the whole way in which women take control of their birth. Myself and Nikita, although we're very experienced and work hard to attend births and to support women with their pregnancy, to make a difference, we can't do this on our own. So we've decided to set up Artemis Birth Attendant Academy. This is where we will teach our expert knowledge to people that want to become birth attendants. They will learn how to support women in natural birth. They will learn how to recognise when medical intervention might be needed. They will learn how to cope in an emergency situation. They will learn alternatives to pharmaceutical medicines and drugs and really be able to support women. They will also learn how to use these skills to support women anywhere in the world and to be able to build their own business where they can go out and help their community also while earning an income for themselves. Myself and Nikita wanted our business to be ethically based and available to everybody. Having good support in your maternity journey shouldn't be based on your income. Artemis Birth Attendant Academy will work in conjunction with Nikita's business when push comes to shove, that already has an existing directory of birth workers throughout the world. Once candidates have completed our 1-year-long in-depth training course, the most superior birth education anywhere in the world today, they will be able to join the directory on when push comes to shove. This directory will be a point of go-to for people wanting to access support on their maternity journeys anywhere in the world. When our candidates receive work through the directory, they are asked to give a 10% donation of their fees to an access fund. The access fund will then be available so that it will cover any expenses of birth workers and birth attendants to be able to attend to women and families that are on low incomes. This means that our services will be available to everybody anywhere. We really truly believe that by training more traditional birth attendants and educating women that they have other choices, that we really could change the world. Peace on earth begins at birth.